The sand was everywhere. In Lieutenant James Brennan's mouth, his eyes the mechanisms of his rifle. Kuwait, February 1991, and the desert wanted to bury everything the Americans brought with them. He crouched beside the compound wall, 32 years old, and already feeling ancient in the brutal heat. Behind him, Army medic Elizabeth Warren kept pace, her med kit bouncing against her hip. She was good, Brennan had noticed. Steady hands during the ambush, 2 days prior when half their unit had taken shrapnel from an RPG that landed too close. She hadn't flinched, just worked through the blood and screaming with the kind of calm that saved lives. The IED was crude by later standards, but effective. Soviet-era construction repurposed by Iraqi engineers who understood that simple often meant reliable. Brennan saw the pressure plate first, then traced the wire back to the daisy chain of artillery shells buried in the sand. Enough explosive to vaporize their entire patrol. His hands moved with practiced precision. Years of training compressed into moments of absolute focus. Cut the wrong wire, apply pressure in the wrong sequence, and 23 soldiers would die before their families back home finished morning coffee. Warren watched from behind cover, her eyes fixed on his hands. She'd seen men die defusing devices like this, had held their hands as they bled out whispering comfort while life drained into foreign soil. Brennan's fingers found the final connection point. This was the moment. This was always the moment. The universe compressed into a single breath, a single choice, a single steady hand. The click of the disconnect sounded like salvation. Warren exhaled, probably for the first time in 3 minutes. Brennan stood wiping sweat from his face and gave the all-clear signal. The patrol moved forward, lives preserved by knowledge and nerve. 2 years later, Coronado Naval Base would host a training exercise. Lieutenant Brennan would volunteer to demonstrate advanced IED disposal techniques to a new generation of combat medics. The device would malfunction. Faulty equipment, the investigation would conclude. Tragic accident, the Navy would report. Elizabeth Warren would survive to serve another 30 years, saving countless lives with the skills she learned that day. James Brennan would die at 34, leaving behind a widow, a 3-year-old daughter with his red hair and steady hands, and a tarnished trident that would never leave his family's possession. The sand took everything eventually. But some legacies refused to stay buried. Commander Sarah Brennan stood before her office mirror, adjusting the collar of her service khakis with movements that had become ritual. 34 years old, the same age her father had been when Kuwait's sand had claimed him. The coincidence wasn't lost on her, though she'd learned long ago that dwelling on such things served no purpose. Her reflection showed the cost of 3 combat tours. A thin scar above her left eyebrow from shrapnel in Kandahar. Sun-weathered skin that no amount of California coastal living would soften. Eyes that had seen too much but refused to look away. Her hair, the same deep red her father had passed down, was pulled back in the regulation ponytail she'd worn since Bud's training. The trident pinned above her ribbon rack caught the morning light. Hers earned through 6 months of deliberate suffering that had broken men twice her size. But it was the second trident, tarnished and carefully wrapped in a small wooden box on her desk, that held her attention this morning. She opened the box, running her thumb over the oxidized metal. Her father's. The one he'd worn the day he'd saved Warren's life. The one he'd been wearing when the training device had torn him apart 2 years later. Sarah had been 3. Old enough to remember fragments. His laugh. The way he'd thrown her in the air and caught her with hands that never shook. The uniform hanging in the closet that her mother had finally boxed up when Sarah turned 12, the same year she'd announced her intention to follow him into naval special warfare. Her mother had said no. Had said hell no. had said, "Over my dead body would another Brennan throw themselves into that meat grinder." Sarah had waited 6 years, enlisted the day she turned 18, and never looked back. The trident was warm in her palm. She closed her fingers around it, feeling the sharp points press against her skin. A reminder. A promise. A burden she'd chosen to carry. Today marked her first day commanding SEAL Team 7. The team didn't know her yet, had received only the bare minimum notification that their previous CO had rotated out and Commander Brennan would take his place. She'd requested it that way. Formal introductions would come this afternoon during the mission briefing, but first she wanted to see them in their natural environment. Wanted to know what she was walking into before they knew to watch their mouths around her. Sarah slipped her father's trident into her breast pocket, feeling its weight settle against her heart. Then she headed for the mess hall. Naval Amphibious Base Coronado buzzed with the particular energy of military dining facilities worldwide. Controlled chaos. Organized disorder. The mess hall at 1100 hours was packed with operators coming off morning PT support staff grabbing quick lunches and Marines from the Visiting Force Reconnaissance Unit that would be partnering with SEAL Team 7 on the upcoming joint operation. Sarah entered quietly, just another officer in service khakis, notable only if someone looked closely enough to see the trident that still turned heads in certain circles. Most didn't look. That was the beauty of anonymity, something she'd lose the moment she stood before her new team this afternoon. The food line moved with institutional efficiency. Salisbury steak that had never seen an actual steak, potatoes that achieved the perfect balance between overcooked and underseasoned, and vegetables that had long ago surrendered any pretense of freshness. Sarah filled her tray with the professionalism of someone who'd learned to eat whatever kept her functional. The dining room sprawled before her, tables arranged in loose clusters that reflected the invisible tribal boundaries of military life. SEALs with SEALs, Marines with Marines, support staff in their own corner, the eternal outsiders looking in. The acoustics turned conversation into a wall of sound words bleeding together into white noise, punctuated by occasional laughter. A table near the center drew her attention. 8 Marines, their table manners reflecting the particular confidence of men who'd seen combat and come back with stories. They sat like they owned the space, which in a way they did. Physical presence counted for something in this world, and these men had presence in abundance. The one doing most of the talking had the bearing of a senior NCO. Gunnery sergeant, if Sarah had to guess from the tattoos visible below his rolled sleeves and the way the others deferred to him. Late 20s, built like someone who treated the gym as a second religion with a Texas accent that carried across the room. Jake Morrison. She'd seen his file that morning. 3rd-generation Marine, impeccable service record, 2 tours in Afghanistan with Force Recon. Father was a retired colonel who'd made his opinions about women in combat roles abundantly clear in several editorial pieces that had circulated through military circles. Son apparently shared the sentiment according to the informal notes in his jacket that spoke of concerns about unit cohesion whenever female leadership was discussed. Lovely. Sarah navigated between tables, tray balanced, finding a path that would take her close enough to Morrison's group to overhear without being obvious about it. The mess hall was crowded enough that proximity meant nothing, just another body trying to find somewhere to sit. She was 3 feet from their table when Morrison's voice rose above the ambient noise. "I'm telling you, the intel's solid. 48-hour window, then we're wheels up." Sarah's steps slowed fractionally. Her morning briefing had covered the same timeline. Joint Operation SEAL Team 7 primary assault element with Marine Force Recon providing perimeter security and quick reaction force. 4 American hostages held in a mountain compound that intelligence suggested was poorly defended but strategically positioned. She moved closer, adjusting her grip on the tray. "What's the hostage situation?" one of the younger Marines asked. "4 Americans, aid workers, apparently." Morrison's tone suggested what he thought of civilians who wandered into war zones with good intentions and no tactical sense. "Been held 3 weeks. Intel says we've got 72 hours before the situation goes terminal." Sarah's jaw tightened. The briefing had mentioned the same execution timeline. What it hadn't mentioned, what she'd only learned when she'd pushed her intelligence contact for details, was the identity of one of the hostages. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, age 58, former Army combat medic, Desert Storm veteran. Current humanitarian worker with an NGO providing medical services in regions where Western medicine was scarce and trust was even scarcer. The woman Sarah's father had died training replacements for. The woman who'd sent a letter every year on the anniversary of James Brennan's death telling his widow and daughter about the lives she'd saved with the skills he'd helped her learn. 3 decades of letters. 3 decades of living the life James Brennan had bought with his own. This wasn't just another mission. This was personal in ways the morning briefing couldn't capture. Sarah squeezed past Morrison's table, the crowd forcing her into close proximity. She felt the tug on her ponytail before she registered the motion, a sharp backward jerk that snapped her head and sent hot anger flooding through her chest. She turned slowly, face carefully neutral, despite the rage screaming beneath her skin. Morrison had released her hair and was grinning at his companions, the casual cruelty of men who'd never faced consequences for such actions written in every line of his posture. "Whoa there, sweetheart." His Texas drawl made the endearment sound like an insult. "Admin offices are that way." He gestured vaguely toward the east side of the base. "This section's for operators." His table erupted in laughter. One of the younger Marines, barely old enough to have finished his first tour, added his contribution. "Yeah, let the operators eat in peace. You're blocking the view." Sarah felt her father's trident pressing against her chest. Felt the weight of 3 combat tours, 6 months of Bud-S hell, and every single moment she'd had to prove herself to men who assumed incompetence until shown otherwise. She opened her mouth to respond, to educate this particular specimen on exactly who she was and what she'd done, but Morrison waved her off before she could speak. "Seriously? Fuck off." He'd already turned back to his companions, dismissing her existence entirely. "We're discussing actual combat operations here. Grown-up stuff." More laughter. More casual cruelty from men who would never understand what it cost to stand in this room wearing this uniform, carrying the legacy she carried. Sarah raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Years of similar encounters had taught her the value of choosing battles carefully. In 4 hours, these men would understand exactly how badly they'd miscalculated. In 4 hours, she'd stand at the front of a briefing room and watch Morrison's face drain of color when he realized who she was. For now, patience. She found a corner table with a clear line of sight to Morrison's group and a position that kept her back to the wall. Old habits from too many phobes, where situational awareness meant the difference between going home and going home in a box. Her food was institutional and forgettable, but Sarah ate with mechanical efficiency, her mind already moving through the afternoon's challenges. The formal introduction to SEAL Team 7. The mission briefing. The first moment of contact with men who'd spent their careers in units that had only recently been forced to acknowledge that women could serve in combat roles. She'd seen the team roster. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 28 explosives expert with a reputation for being technically brilliant and socially conservative. His father had served with James Brennan, which would either help or hurt, depending on whether Webb Sr. had shared his opinions about his friend's daughter joining the teams. Chief David Hutchison, 38 Senior, enlisted with 2 decades of experience and the kind of quiet authority that came from watching young operators learn and die in equal measure. grandson of a Korean War veteran according to his file. Old military family traditional values likely to view female leadership with skepticism until proven otherwise. Petty Officer Kyle Jennings, 25 communications specialist from rural Wisconsin with perfect technical scores and no disciplinary issues. Unknown quantity. Could go either way. And then there was the Marine attachment. Morrison's Force Recon Unit, 8 operators including Corporal Emma Blackwell, 24 years old sniper school graduate, one of perhaps a dozen female Marine snipers currently serving. Sarah had made note of her name, specifically wondering if Blackwell faced the same casual dismissal from Morrison that Sarah had just experienced. Probably worse, actually. Morrison could ignore a passing officer. He had to work with Blackwell daily. Sarah finished her meal and checked her watch. 1,300 hours. 2 hours until the briefing. She needed to review the intelligence packet one more time, particularly the satellite imagery of the target compound. Something about the structure had tickled the back of her memory during the morning briefing, a familiar architectural pattern she couldn't quite place. She disposed of her tray, keeping her movements unhurried and unremarkable. Morrison's table had moved on to other topics, their voices loud with the particular confidence of men who believe themselves untouchable. As Sarah headed toward the exit, she allowed herself the smallest smile. Morrison had no idea what was coming. None of them did. 4 hours from now, everything would change. For now, she'd let them enjoy their certainty. Sarah's office in the Team 7 building was utilitarian in the way all military offices were utilitarian. Desk chair computer terminal filing cabinets with locks that theoretically kept classified material secure. The walls were bare except for a clock that ran 3 minutes fast and a photograph of the Naval Special Warfare Trident that someone had hung decades ago and no one had bothered to remove. Her predecessor had left the space clean, which she appreciated. No personal effects to pack away, no lingering presence to exercise. Just empty drawers and a fresh start that felt both promising and terrifying. Sarah locked the door and pulled the classified intelligence packet from her safe. She'd read it twice already, but details mattered. Lives hung on knowing the difference between Soviet-era concrete composition and modern construction techniques. Success often came down to understanding that the intelligence community's best guesses were exactly that, guesses refined by analysis, but still fundamentally uncertain. The target compound sat in mountainous terrain along what had once been a major Soviet supply route during their ill-fated Afghanistan adventure. The structures showed the characteristic brutalist design of 1980s Soviet military construction. Thick walls, minimal windows, defensive positions integrated into the architecture itself. Sarah spread the satellite imagery across her desk, studying the compound's layout with eyes trained to see patterns. The main building dominated the center, 3 stories of reinforced concrete with firing positions on the upper levels. 2 auxiliary structures flanked it, connected by covered walkways that would allow defenders to move between buildings without exposing themselves to airstrikes. Smart design for the Cold War era, when the Soviets had expected to face Mujahideen with RPGs rather than American JDAMs. But there was something else. Sarah pulled a magnifying glass from her desk drawer and examined the eastern wall more closely. The construction pattern, the placement of the ventilation shafts, the way the foundation integrated with the terrain, she'd seen this before. Not in person, in photographs. Black and white images from her grandfather's papers, archived documents her mother had finally given her after Sarah had made it through BUDS and proved she wasn't going to quit this life. Theodore Brennan had served in the Pacific during World War II, a Navy frogman before they'd formalized the term. After VJ Day, he'd been recruited by the Office of Strategic Services for post-war operations in occupied Germany. His particular specialty had been infiltrating Soviet-controlled facilities, documenting their construction and defensive methodologies, gathering intelligence that would help the West understand how the Russians built their military infrastructure. Her grandfather had died when Sarah was 10, but not before spending countless hours telling her stories about his service. About the importance of understanding your enemy, not just as an adversary, but as an engineer, an architect, a human being, making rational decisions within their own framework of logic. The compound in the satellite imagery matched patterns from her grandfather's documentation. Soviet field engineers had used standardized designs across multiple theaters, copying what worked and adapting only slightly for local conditions. If this compound followed the standard template, and the imagery suggested it did, then there would be features the current intelligence assessment had missed. Maintenance tunnels, specifically. The Soviets had built their facilities with the assumption that they might need to evacuate under fire or move supplies without being observed. Every major compound included underground passages connecting to egress points outside the primary defensive perimeter. Intelligence hadn't mentioned tunnels. The briefing materials included no assessment of below-ground infrastructure. Either the analysts had missed it, or the satellite imagery wasn't sophisticated enough to detect what lay beneath several feet of rock and earth. Sarah made a note in her mission planning file. Potential egress route not in current intel assessment. Requires ground confirmation, but should be considered during tactical planning. It was the kind of detail that might mean nothing. Or it might mean the difference between extraction under fire and dying in a collapsed building with no way out. She checked her watch again. 1,400 hours. 1 hour until showtime. Sarah stood and moved to the small mirror mounted inside her locker door. Her uniform was impeccable as always. Ribbons in perfect alignment trident polished to a subdued shine that wouldn't reflect light during night operations. Hair regulation tight in its ponytail. She reached for her father's trident, the tarnished metal warm from spending the day against her heart. For a moment, she considered pinning it beside her own. A visible reminder of legacy, of sacrifice, of the price her family had already paid for service. No. That wasn't today's message. Today was about command, about establishing herself as the operator who would lead SEAL Team 7 into harm's way and bring them home alive. Her father's memory could wait for quieter moments. Sarah returned the trident to its box and locked her safe. Then she gathered her briefing materials, took one last look in the mirror, and headed for the building where her new team was already gathering. Time to meet the men who would decide whether she was their commander or just another diversity checkbox the Navy was forcing them to tolerate. The briefing room could hold 50 personnel comfortably. Today it held 23, and the tension made it feel like twice that number. Sarah arrived early, entering through a side door that let her assess the room before anyone noticed her presence. The seating arrangement told her everything she needed to know about tribal allegiances and existing power structures. SEAL Team 7 occupied the front rows. 6 men, various ages and ranks, sitting with the loose confidence of operators who'd worked together long enough to develop their own unspoken communication patterns. They talked quietly among themselves, voices low enough that Sarah couldn't make out specific words, but loud enough to convey that they weren't particularly concerned about whoever was about to take command. The Marines sat behind them, Morrison's Force Recon Unit, maintaining the separation between services that would need to be bridged before they deployed together. Morrison himself sat in the center of his group, still eating another protein bar, apparently his constant companion while holding court with the same casual authority he'd displayed in the mess hall. He hadn't seen her yet. None of them had. Sarah moved to the front of the room, setting her briefing materials on the podium with enough noise to draw attention without seeming to demand it. Conversations died in waves as operators looked up and registered her presence. She watched Morrison's face, watched the exact moment recognition hit him like a claymore mine at close range. The protein bar stopped halfway to his mouth. His complexion went from sun-weathered tan to ash gray in the span of 2 heartbeats. The wrapper slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor, forgotten. Sarah let the silence stretch. Let them all understand that something significant was happening, even if most of them didn't yet know what. Then she spoke, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who'd earned the right to command through blood and competence rather than rank alone. "Good afternoon. I'm Commander Sarah Brennan, SEAL Team 7. I'll be your commanding officer for this operation and all subsequent operations until such time as Naval Special Warfare Command decides otherwise." She let that sink in. Watch the micro-expressions. Webb's eyes narrowing in assessment. Hutchison's carefully neutral face that gave away nothing. Jennings looking between her and the SEAL team veterans, trying to gauge the appropriate response. Morrison looked like he wanted the floor to open and swallow him whole. "We deploy at 0400 tomorrow. Wheels up from North Island, target insertion 4300 hours local time. The mission is straightforward, but time-sensitive." Sarah activated the projector, throwing satellite imagery onto the screen behind her. 4 hostages, all American civilians, working with an NGO providing medical services in the Coast Province region. They were taken 3 weeks ago by an insurgent group with ties to larger terrorist networks we've been tracking for the past 18 months. She zoomed in on the compound, highlighting key defensive positions. Intelligence suggests a 72-hour execution timeline. We're at hour 68. Our window is closing, gentlemen. This will be a joint operation. SEAL Team 7 provides primary assault element. Marine Force reconnaissance provides perimeter security and quick reaction force. Questions so far? Silence. They were still processing, still trying to reconcile the woman Morrison had dismissed in the mess hall with the commander now briefing them on a hostage rescue operation. Sarah continued walking them through the tactical plan with the kind of detail that demonstrated she'd done this before. Insertion routes, helicopter landing zones, enemy force estimates, rules of engagement, extraction contingencies. Every aspect of the operation laid out with professional precision. When she reached the discussion of approach angles to the primary structure, Lieutenant Webb raised his hand. Sarah nodded at him. "Ma'am, the planned route exposes us for approximately 45 seconds while we cross from the low ground to the compound wall. That's a significant vulnerability window if the enemy has any competent defensive positions." Good question. Tactical thinking without the bullshit. Sarah appreciated that. "Excellent observation, Lieutenant. Let me walk you through the ballistics." She pulled up a terrain analysis overlay. Primary enemy firing positions are here, here, and here, approximately 1,200 meters from our approach vector. Standard engagement ranges for the AK pattern rifles we expect them to be carrying. She pulled up her notes, the calculations she'd run that morning. At 1,200 meters, a 7.62 by 51 millimeter round, which is what we'd face from a Dragunov if they have a trained marksman worst-case scenario, has a flight time of approximately 1.8 seconds. Current weather forecast shows winds from the northwest at 8 to 12 knots, which translates to a drift of roughly 4.2 inches at that range. Sarah looked directly at Webb. By the time any competent enemy shooter acquires a target, compensates for wind and range, and takes a shot, we'll have reached the defilade position behind this terrain feature. Their effective window for engagement is less than 10 seconds. Against a moving target at that range in limited visibility conditions, their probability of hit drops below 15%. Acceptable risk given the timeline constraints we're operating under. The room had gone completely silent. Sarah had just demonstrated graduate-level understanding of ballistics terrain analysis, and tactical probability assessment. The kind of knowledge that came from years of study, combined with practical application under fire. Webb nodded slowly. Understood, ma'am. Thank you for the breakdown. Any other questions about the tactical approach? No hands. Sarah moved to the next phase of the briefing, detailing the breach methodology and building clearance procedures. She assigned specific roles matching operators to positions based on their personnel files and the capabilities their previous commanders had documented. Morrison hadn't said a word, hadn't raised his hand, hadn't made eye contact. He sat perfectly still, looking like a man watching his entire worldview collapse in real time. Sarah finished the tactical overview and moved to individual assignments. Lieutenant Webb, you'll lead the breach team. Your explosives expertise makes you the logical choice for initial entry. Chief Hutchison, you'll command the support element. I want your experience keeping the perimeter secure and our extraction route open. Petty Officer Jennings' communications are critical on this operation. You'll be attached to my element and responsible for maintaining contact with all teams plus the QRF. She turned her attention to the Marines. Gunnery Sergeant Morrison, your Force Recon unit will establish overwatch positions here, here, and here. She indicated points on the satellite imagery. You'll provide suppressive fire during our approach and cover our extraction. You'll also serve as the quick reaction force if the situation develops in ways we haven't anticipated. Clear. Morrison's voice came out rough, like he was forcing words through a throat that wanted to stay closed. Crystal clear, ma'am. Good. Sarah locked eyes with him, letting him see that she remembered the mess hall, remembered the hair pulling and the dismissal and the casual cruelty. Letting him understand that she was professional enough not to let it affect the mission, but not so professional that she'd forgotten. One more thing before we break for individual team briefs. Sarah pulled up the hostage photographs. 4 faces filled the screen. 3, she didn't recognize young aid workers who'd believed they could make a difference in a part of the world that ate idealists for breakfast. The 4th face she knew from 3 decades of photographs. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, 58 years old, former Army combat medic with service in Desert Storm. She's been operating in the region for 5 years, providing medical training to local healthcare workers. Intelligence suggests she was the primary target, the others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sarah kept her voice level professional, betraying nothing of the personal connection that made this mission different from every other hostage rescue she'd participated in. Dr. Warren has combat experience and medical training. If we're lucky, she's been keeping the other hostages stable and managing their physical and psychological condition. If we're not lucky, her background makes her a high-value target for propaganda purposes. Either way, she's our priority extraction. She closed the presentation and faced her new team. We have 16 hours until departure. Use them wisely. Check your equipment, review your assignments, get your minds right. This is a straightforward operation with a tight timeline and limited intelligence. We go in fast, we extract our people, we get out. No heroics. No unnecessary risks. Everyone comes home. Questions. Silence. Dismissed. Team leaders remain behind for individual mission packages. The room emptied, quickly, operators heading for their equipment lockers and pre-mission routines. Morrison was among the first out the door, moving with the urgency of someone who desperately needed to be anywhere else. Webb, Hutchison, and Jennings approached the podium. Sarah handed each of them classified folders containing their specific mission elements and tactical packages. Lieutenant Webb, a word about the breach charges. Ma'am, the compound walls are Soviet-era construction, likely reinforced concrete with aggregate that includes limestone from local quarries. standard composition for that era and region. Your C4 calculations need to account for approximately 20% additional density compared to standard modern concrete. Undershoot the charge and we're stuck outside. Overshoot and we risk structural collapse that could trap or kill the hostages. Webb opened his folder and checked the specification sheet included. His eyes widened slightly. This is very specific intelligence, Commander. May I ask where you got the construction details? Sarah allowed herself the smallest smile. My grandfather spent time in occupied Germany after World War II documenting Soviet construction methodologies for the OSS. The intelligence community has mostly forgotten that era's institutional knowledge, but I've made it a point to study the family archives. Soviet field engineers used standardized designs across multiple theaters. If this compound matches the pattern and the imagery suggests it does, then these specifications should be accurate. Webb nodded slowly, a respect evident in his expression. Understood, ma'am. I'll adjust the calculations accordingly. Good. Chief Hutchison, you'll need to review the QRF coordination protocols with Gunnery Sergeant Morrison. I know inter-service operations can be challenging, but this mission requires seamless integration. Make it work. Aye, ma'am. Hutchison's gravelly voice suggested he'd dealt with more difficult challenges than coordinating with Marines. Petty Officer Jennings, the communications package includes frequencies and encryption keys for all elements. I want redundant systems checked twice. We cannot afford to lose contact during the critical phases of this operation. Understood, Commander. I'll personally verify every system before we load. Sarah dismissed them and gathered her briefing materials. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting the empty room in shades of gold that reminded her of Kuwait sand in photographs. Her father had stood in rooms like this briefing operations he wouldn't survive, had probably felt the same weight of responsibility, the same understanding that his decisions would determine who lived and who died. Sarah touched the pocket where his trident rested, feeling its familiar weight. I've got this one, Dad, she whispered to the empty room. I'll bring them home. Then she locked the briefing room and headed for the armory. 16 hours until wheels up. 16 hours to make sure every piece of equipment worked perfectly, every operator understood their role, and every contingency had been planned for. 16 hours until she proved to SEAL Team 7 and Morrison's Marines that Commander Sarah Brennan had earned every bit of authority her rank implied. The mission would be straightforward. The politics would be complicated. And somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, Dr. Elizabeth Warren was counting down the hours until either rescue or execution, unaware that the daughter of the man who'd saved her life 3 decades ago was coming to return the favor. Sarah checked her watch one final time. 15 hours, 43 minutes. Time to get to work. The weapons range at Coronado existed in a perpetual state of controlled violence. Downrange paper targets absorbed thousands of rounds daily, their centers obliterated by operators who treated marksmanship as both religion and science. The smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air, mixing with salt spray from the Pacific Ocean just beyond the berms. Sarah arrived at 0600 2 hours before the rest of Team 7 was scheduled for final weapons qualification. The range master, a weathered chief petty officer named Donald Reeves, was already there setting up target stands with movements that suggested he'd been doing this particular job since before Sarah was born. He looked up as she approached, his eyes tracking from her face to the trident on her chest and back again. His expression shifted through several calculations before settling on professional courtesy. Commander Brennan, wasn't expecting anyone this early. Wanted to get some trigger time before the formal qualifications, Chief. Hope that's not a problem. Reeves studied her for a long moment, then gestured toward the weapons lockers. Your range, ma'am. What are you shooting? M4A1, HK416, and M110. Full qualification course for all three. His eyebrows rose fractionally. Most officers qualified on their primary weapon and called it good. Running the full battery suggested either insecurity that needed constant validation or competence that demanded maintenance. Sarah suspected Reeves was trying to determine which category she fell into. I'll set the lanes, he said finally. Standard engagement distances, or do you want something specific? Standard course is fine. I'm not here to impress anyone, Chief. Just want to make sure my skills are sharp before we deploy. Reeves nodded and moved to prepare the range. Sarah retrieved her M4A1 from the armory, the weapon she'd carried through 3 combat tours and countless training exercises. The rifle was an extension of her body, at this point its weight and balance as familiar as her own hands. She loaded magazines with the methodical precision of someone who understood that ammunition was life. 30 rounds per magazine, checked twice for proper seating and spring tension. No room for malfunctions when lives depended on every trigger pull. The M4 qualification course ran through multiple engagement scenarios. Close quarters at 7 meters. Standard infantry ranges out to 300 meters. Rapid target acquisition drills. Shooting from cover. Shooting while moving. The course was designed to stress test not just marksmanship, but tactical decision-making under pressure. Sarah settled into her firing stance, the rifle stock tight against her shoulder, her breathing slow and controlled. The first target appeared at 7 meters. She put 2 rounds center mass before most shooters would have acquired a proper sight picture. The morning passed in controlled bursts of noise and concentration. Each weapon received the same treatment. 40 rounds through the M4A1 perfect score. 50 rounds through the HK416 perfect score. The M110 sniper rifle required different techniques, different breathing patterns, but the results were identical. Every shot exactly where she'd intended it to go. By the time Team 7 arrived for their scheduled qualification, Sarah had already cleaned her weapons and was observing from the tower where Reeves tracked scores and called range commands. Lieutenant Webb was first up, his movements efficient but slightly rushed. He shot well, scoring in the high 30s out of 40 on his M4 course. Competent, but not exceptional. Chief Hutchison moved like a man who'd been shooting since childhood, which according to his personnel file was exactly the case. His grandfather had taught him to shoot at age 6, starting with a .22 rifle and working up to every weapon system the military offered. His score reflected that history. 40 out of 40, not a single miss. Petty Officer Jennings surprised Sarah with his marksmanship. The communications specialist from rural Wisconsin put 38 rounds exactly where they needed to be, his farm boy background translating into the kind of practical shooting that came from necessity rather than tactical training. The Marines arrived as Team 7 finished Morrison's Force Recon unit, moving with the aggressive confidence of men who believe themselves the apex predators of the military food chain. They shot well, as Sarah expected. Force Recon selection standards demanded it. Corporal Emma Blackwell shot last among the Marines, and Sarah paid particular attention. The young sniper moved with careful precision, her body language suggesting someone who'd learned to be perfect because anything less would be used as evidence of inadequacy. Blackwell's score matched Hutchison's. 40 out of 40, not a single miss, with groupings tight enough to suggest she could have done it blindfolded. Morris and Sarah noticed, didn't congratulate her, didn't acknowledge the exceptional performance at all. He simply moved to the next lane and began his own qualification as if Blackwell's competence was somehow threatening rather than commendable. Sarah descended from the tower as the Marines finished their quals. She walked to where her M4A1 stood in its rack, removed it, and without announcement moved to the lane beside Morrison. Conversations stopped. Operators who'd been packing gear or reviewing scores turned to watch. Sarah loaded a fresh magazine, assumed her firing stance, and waited for Reeves to call the course hot. The targets appeared in rapid succession. Sarah engaged each one with mechanical efficiency, her movements economical and precise. No wasted motion, no hesitation, just smooth trigger pulls and the particular rhythm of controlled violence that separated professionals from amateurs. 40 rounds, 40 hits. Center mass groupings tight enough that most of the holes overlapped. She cleared her weapon, made it safe, and stepped back from the line. The silence stretched for 3 long seconds before someone in the back muttered just loud enough to be heard. "Guess they taught marksmanship in admin school." Sarah didn't respond. Didn't need to. The target downrange spoke for itself. Morrison stared at his own target, then at hers, his jaw working like he wanted to say something but couldn't quite form the words. His score had been 37 out of 40. Excellent by any standard, but standing next to Sarah's perfect performance, it looked insufficient. Reeves called down from the tower, his gravelly voice carrying across the range. "Commander Brennan, that's the 3rd perfect score I've seen you shoot this morning. Your grandfather taught you that." Sarah looked up at the tower, surprised that Reeves knew anything about her family history. The old chief must have seen her confusion because he continued. "Theodore Brennan taught me to shoot at Camp Pendleton in 1968. I was 18 years old and convinced I knew everything about rifles. Your grandfather spent 3 days showing me exactly how wrong I was." Reeves smiled, the expression softening his weathered face. "You got his eye, Commander. And his patience. He'd be proud of what you've become." Sarah felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. Recognition from someone who'd actually known her grandfather meant more than 1,000 perfect scores. "Thank you, Chief. That means a great deal." "Just calling it like I see it, ma'am." Reeves made a notation on his clipboard. "Team 7 and Marine Attachment are all qualified. You're clear for deployment." Sarah secured her weapon and headed for the equipment lockers. Behind her, she heard Morrison's voice, low and angry, talking to one of his Marines. The words were indistinct, but the tone was clear. He was realizing that his assumptions had been catastrophically wrong, and the realization wasn't sitting well. Good. Let him stew in it. They had work to do, and personal feelings couldn't be allowed to interfere with mission success. But as Sarah walked away from the range, she allowed herself the smallest smile of satisfaction. That would give them something to think about during the long flight to Afghanistan. Sarah reviewed Webb's breach calculations one final time in the mission planning room. The Soviet construction analysis checked out. Everything was ready. 6 hours until wheels up. Time to get some rest before everything started moving too fast to think. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a photo she'd taken years ago. Her father's dress uniform laid out on her mother's bed the day they'd buried him with full military honors. Sarah had been too young to attend the funeral, too young to understand what it meant that he wasn't coming home. But she'd taken the photo anyway, some instinct telling her to preserve the memory before it was packed away. The uniform in the photo looked impossibly large, larger than the man she barely remembered. But the trident pinned above the ribbons that was exactly the right size, the same size as the one pressing against her heart right now. "I'll bring them home, Dad," she whispered to the empty room. "I'll bring all of them home." Then she locked the mission planning room and headed for the barracks. 6 hours until wheels up. Time to get some rest before everything started moving too fast to think. The MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters sat on the tarmac at Naval Air Station North Island, their rotors still and silent in the pre-dawn darkness. Crew chiefs performed final inspections, checking fuel systems and weapons mounts with the methodical precision of people who understood that small oversights could become fatal failures at 8,000 feet. Sarah arrived at the staging area at 0330, 30 minutes before the scheduled departure. The rest of Team 7 was already there, operators moving through pre-flight rituals with practiced efficiency. Some checked weapons for the third or fourth time. Others stood quietly, headphones in, listening to whatever music helped them transition from peacetime to combat mindset. Webb approached her, his face painted with camouflage that made him look simultaneously younger and older. "All charges prepared and loaded, ma'am. Triple-check the calculations per your specifications." "Good. Remember, if the wall composition doesn't match our assessment, don't hesitate to adjust on the ground. I'd rather take extra time getting the breach right than blow through into a structural collapse." "Understood, Commander." Morrison's Marines loaded into their designated aircraft, the Force Recon Unit moving with their own particular brand of controlled aggression. Blackwell carried her M110 sniper rifle with the careful attention of someone who knew her weapon was the difference between successful overwatch and dead teammates. Morrison caught Sarah's eye across the tarmac. He didn't nod, didn't acknowledge her in any way, just held her gaze for a moment before boarding his aircraft. His expression was unreadable beneath the camouflage paint. At 0355, the flight commander gave the signal to board. Sarah climbed into her designated Black Hawk, settling into the troop seat with practiced movements. The helicopter could carry 11 passengers in addition to crew, but today it held only 8. Team 7's assault element, compact and lethal. The turbines spooled up their rising whine, cutting through the night. Sarah felt the familiar vibration through the airframe, the particular frequency that meant they were about to leave the ground. She touched her father's trident one last time, then pulled on her helmet and checked her communications. Valkyrie 6 to all elements comms check. One by one her team responded. Webb, Hutchison, Jennings, the rest of the assault element. Then Morrison's gravelly voice from the second aircraft. Reaper 1-6 solid copy. Good. Maintain radio discipline during transit. We'll switch to tactical frequency at IP. Flight time approximately 4 hours. Refuel stop in Turkey. Get some rest while you can. The helicopters lifted into the darkness, leaving California behind. Through the open door, Sarah watched the lights of San Diego recede into pinpoints, then disappear entirely as they flew over open ocean. 4 hours to the refuel stop. Then another 6 hours to the border insertion point. Then the mission would begin, and all the planning and preparation would distill into moments of controlled violence that would determine whether 4 hostages lived or died. Jennings sat across from her, his young face serious beneath the helmet. He caught her looking and gave a slight nod, trying for confident but achieving somewhere closer to determined. Sarah smiled behind her face mask. That was the thing about combat operations. Everyone was scared. The professionals just learned to function despite the fear. She closed her eyes and let the helicopter's vibration lull her into the light sleep that operators learn to achieve anywhere, anytime. Rest was a weapon as important as ammunition. She'd need all her sharpness for what was coming. The helicopter flew east through the darkness, carrying them toward mountains where hostile forces held American citizens and waited for the rescue attempt they surely expected. Everything depended on speed, surprise, and the willingness to do violence more effectively than the enemy could respond. Sarah's last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was of Dr. Elizabeth Warren, somewhere in those mountains, counting down the hours until execution or rescue. Unaware that James Brennan's daughter was coming to finish what her father had started 3 decades ago in different sand, under different circumstances, but with the same unwavering commitment to bringing Americans home. The helicopters flew on through the night, carrying Sarah toward the moment that would define her command and prove whether she truly earned the right to wear her father's legacy. The refuel stop in Turkey passed in a blur of organized chaos. Fuel trucks, security perimeters, intelligence updates that changed nothing substantive but added minor details to their tactical picture. Sarah used the 30-minute stop to review satellite imagery one more time, looking for changes in the compound's defensive posture. Nothing obvious. The enemy either didn't know they were coming or was confident enough in their defensive position not to bother with additional preparations. Sarah hoped for the former, but planned for the latter. The second leg of the flight took them into darker skies, leaving the lights of civilization behind for the mountainous terrain of Afghanistan. The landscape below was invisible in the pre-dawn darkness, but Sarah knew it intimately from previous deployments. Harsh valleys, peaks that scraped 10,000 feet, rivers that ran seasonal and angry. Beautiful country if you could ignore the centuries of blood soaked into its soil. At 04:15 local time, they crossed into Afghan airspace. The helicopters dropped to nap-of-the-earth altitude following terrain contours to avoid radar detection. The flight became rougher, the aircraft banking and diving to maintain their low profile. Sarah felt her stomach protest the aggressive maneuvering but forced it down through sheer will. Air sickness was for rookies. She was a SEAL commander bringing her people into harm's way. No room for weakness, real or perceived. Valkyrie 6. "This is Overwatch," crackled her radio. ISR assets overhead watching their approach and the target area simultaneously. Target area shows no change from last assessment. Estimate 4 to 6 enemy personnel, visible possibly more inside structures. No heavy weapons visible. Copy Overwatch. Maintain surveillance and advise of any changes. Roger Valkyrie 6. Good hunting. Sarah switched to the team frequency. All elements IP in 2 minutes. Switch to tactical frequency and maintain noise discipline. Remember your assignments. We go in fast, extract the hostages, and get out. No heroics. Everyone comes home. The acknowledgments came in terse professional bursts. Her people were ready. The helicopters banked hard, following the pre-planned insertion route that would bring them to a landing zone 2 kilometers from the target. Close enough to reach on foot, quickly far enough that the sound of the helicopters wouldn't alert the enemy to their exact position. Sarah felt the familiar pre-combat clarity settling over her. Fear didn't disappear. Anyone who said they weren't afraid before combat was either lying or sociopathic. But fear became something manageable, something that sharpened focus instead of paralyzing it. 1 minute to LZ, the crew chief announced. Sarah checked her rifle one final time. M4A1 30 rounds loaded, additional magazines in her vest. Sidearm secured. Grenades, medical kit, communications equipment. Everything in its place, everything ready. The helicopter flared hard, killing forward momentum as the pilots brought it to a hover 3 feet above the ground. Sarah was out before the skids touched Earth, her team following in smooth succession. Within 10 seconds, all personnel were clear, and the helicopter was lifting away, leaving them in sudden silence, broken only by the fading rotor noise. Sarah took a knee, letting her eyes adjust to the darkness while her team formed up around her. Night vision goggles turned the world into green-tinged clarity, revealing the terrain that would either help or kill them in the next hour. Morrison's Marines had landed 30 seconds behind them, spreading out to establish the perimeter security that was their primary mission. Through her no-Ds, Sarah saw Blackwell moving to a high point with her sniper rifle, setting up the overwatch position that would provide early warning of enemy movement. Valkyrie 6 to Reaper 1-6. Perimeter secure. Reaper 1-6, affirmative. "You're clear to move." Sarah stood and signaled her team forward. They moved in tactical formation, spacing maintained automatically through countless training repetitions. The distance to the compound was 2 kilometers of broken terrain rocks and shallow wadis that provided cover but slowed movement. They covered the ground in 28 minutes faster than the conservative timeline Sarah had planned. Good. Speed was life on operations like this. At 100 meters from the compound, Sarah halted the team. Webb moved forward with his breach charges disappearing into the darkness with the ghost-like movement of a professional operator. Hutchison positioned the support element to cover multiple angles simultaneously. Jennings stayed at Sarah's shoulder, ready to relay commands to all elements. Sarah studied the compound through her Naudis, comparing what she saw to the satellite imagery she'd memorized. The structure matched expectations. 3-story main building, 2 auxiliaries, thick walls, showing the characteristic Soviet brutalism that had infected this region decades ago. But something was wrong. The defensive positions were too quiet. 6 enemy personnel should be visible, moving on patrol, or manning observation points. Instead, she saw nothing. No movement. No lights. No indication that anyone was home. Valkyrie 6 to Overwatch. Do you still have heat signatures in the target area? The response took 5 seconds too long. Overwatch to Valkyrie 6, negative. Thermals show compound is cold. Say again, no heat signatures detected. Sarah's gut clenched. They'd been expected. The enemy had either moved the hostages or set a trap, or both. She keyed her radio to Webb's frequency. Hold position. Target may be compromised. Before Webb could acknowledge alarm shrieked across the compound. Lights blazed to life, destroying Sarah's night vision advantage. And gunfire erupted from positions that hadn't been there in any intelligence assessment. The mission had just gone from rescue to survival in the span of 3 heartbeats. The world exploded into chaos. Muzzle flashes erupted from positions that intelligence had sworn were abandoned structures. Tracer rounds cut green lines through the darkness, searching for American flesh. Sarah's night vision goggles turned the sudden lights into blinding white novas before she ripped them off and let them dangle. Contact front multiple positions. Webb's voice came through tight with controlled aggression. They were waiting for us. Sarah's mind processed the tactical situation in microseconds. The compound had been a trap from the beginning. The enemy knew they were coming, had positioned fighters in concealed locations, and activated the ambush at the exact moment when the assault force was most vulnerable, committed to the approach, but not yet in cover. Classic Soviet doctrine. Her grandfather would have recognized it immediately. All elements suppressive fire and fall back to rally point alpha. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos with command authority that demanded obedience. Reaper 1-6, we need fire support on the compound's eastern positions now. Morrison's response was immediate. Reaper engaging. The distinctive crack of Blackwell's M110 sniper rifle punctuated the chaos. Somewhere in the compound, an enemy fighter discovered that standing near a light source made for easy target acquisition. The light shattered as the body fell. But there were more. So many more than intelligence had suggested. Sarah counted at least 15 muzzle flashes, possibly 20. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and caught in the open with minimal cover. Webb's grenade launcher thumped, sending 40mm high explosive rounds into the defensive positions. The explosions provided momentary suppression enough for Team 7 to bound backward toward the relative safety of the wadi they'd crossed minutes earlier. Sarah ran in controlled bursts using every scrap of terrain for concealment. Bullets snapped past her head with the distinctive crack that meant they were close enough to feel the sonic pressure. One round struck her plate carrier, the impact like being punched in the chest by an angry heavyweight. The ceramic plate held distributing the energy across her torso, but it hurt like hell. She made it to the wadi and dropped into cover beside Hutchison. The chief was already on his radio coordinating with Morrison's Marines to establish interlocking fields of fire that would prevent the enemy from pursuing their momentary advantage. "Webb status," Sarah demanded. "Assault element intact, no casualties. We're pinned down but holding small miracles. They'd survived the initial ambush without losses." Now came the hard part, figuring out what the hell had happened to the hostages and whether this entire operation had been compromised from the beginning. "Jennings, get me Overwatch right now." The young communications specialist was already working his equipment, his hands steady, despite the bullets impacting the dirt 6 inches from his position. "Overwatch is trying to raise us, ma'am. Multiple transmissions coming through." Sarah grabbed the handset. "Overwatch, Valkyrie 6. Situation has developed. Target was pre-positioned for ambush. Need immediate assessment of thermal signatures in alternate structures. The hostages have been moved." "Valkyrie 6, stand by." The ISR operator's voice carried the particular stress of someone watching Americans die in real time through thermal cameras. "Scanning adjacent structures now. Wait 1. The firefight continued with the intensity of sustained combat. Morrison's Marines were pouring fire into the compound from their elevated positions, forcing the enemy to stay under cover rather than maneuvering to flank the trapped SEAL element. Sarah made a mental note to thank the gunnery sergeant if they survived the next 10 minutes. "Valkyrie 6 Overwatch. We have thermal signatures 200 meters north of primary target. Secondary structure appears to be old Soviet-era construction, matches the architectural profile you briefed. Count 4 hot signatures, 3 mobile and 1 stationary. Assess the stationary signature may be injured or restrained." Sarah's mind raced. 200 meters north. She pulled up her mental map of the area, overlaying her grandfather's OSS documentation of Soviet facility layouts. If this compound followed standard patterns, the secondary structure would have been an auxiliary command post or communications facility. And if it followed standard patterns, it would have the same maintenance tunnel system that Soviet engineers had built into every permanent installation. "Webb Hutchison on me." Sarah scrambled backward through the wadi putting distance between herself and the enemy fire. Her team leaders joined her, both breathing hard but focused. The hostages aren't in the main compound. They're in a secondary structure 200 meters north. Intelligence missed it because it wasn't part of the primary target assessment. Webb wiped blood from his face where shrapnel had opened a shallow cut across his cheek. "How do we get there without fighting through the entire enemy force?" Sarah pulled out her laminated map and pointed to the topography. "There's a dried riverbed that runs northeast from our current position. It'll provide concealment for most of the movement. But more importantly, if that secondary structure follows Soviet construction patterns, it'll have underground maintenance tunnels. We can approach from below ground, bypass their defenses entirely." Hutchison studied the map with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 20 years reading terrain. "Big if, Commander. What if the tunnel system doesn't exist, or has collapsed? Then we adapt. But I'm betting Soviet engineers didn't change their doctrine between Germany and Afghanistan. They built redundancy into every facility. The tunnels exist." Webb nodded slowly. "It's our best option. Trying to fight through that ambush force would take too long, and we're already at hour 70 of the execution timeline. We don't have time for a conventional assault." Sarah keyed her radio. "Reaper 16 Valkyrie 6. I need your Marines to keep the enemy fixed on the primary compound. Make them think we're preparing for a second assault attempt. Can you sustain that for 30 mics? Morrison's response carried the strain of someone under heavy fire. Affirmative, Valkyrie 6. We'll keep them busy. But 30 minutes is pushing it. We're expending ammunition faster than I'd like. Understood. Use fire discipline but maintain pressure. We're moving to the alternate location. We'll advise when we have the hostages. Roger. Reaper out. Sarah turned to her team. We move in 5 mics. Webb, you're on point with breach charges ready. Hutchison, bring the support element and cover our 6. Jennings stays with me for communications. Questions? No one spoke. They were professionals. They understood that sometimes missions deviated so far from the plan that the plan became irrelevant. What mattered was adapting faster than the enemy could respond. Sarah led her reduced team northeast through the wadi, using the terrain to mask their movement from the enemy positions still engaged with Morrison's Marines. The sound of sustained firefight provided audio cover for their movement. Every bullet the enemy fired at Morrison was a bullet not fired at her team. The riverbed twisted through broken terrain, sometimes offering perfect concealment and sometimes forcing them to low crawl across exposed sections while rounds impacted nearby. Sarah's shoulders burned from the weight of her equipment. Her knees protested the rough stone, but she kept moving. Pain was temporary. Failure was permanent. After 18 minutes of movement that felt like hours, they reached the position Overwatch had identified. The structure was smaller than the main compound, partially collapsed on one side, seemingly abandoned. But thermal imaging didn't lie. 4 heat signatures inside meant hostages or guards or both. Sarah studied the building through her rifle scope. Soviet construction, definitely. The characteristic brutalist design, thick walls, minimal windows. But something about the foundation caught her attention. A ventilation shaft barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness protruding from the ground 30 meters from the main structure. Exactly where maintenance tunnel access would be if Soviet engineers had followed their standard template. Webb, see that ventilation shaft? The lieutenant tracked where she was pointing. Affirmative. You think that's tunnel access? Only one way to find out. Take Petty Officer Reynolds and check it. If it leads underground, that's our entry point. If not, we go to Plan B. What's Plan B, ma'am? I'm working on it. Move. Webb and Reynolds disappeared into the darkness, approaching the ventilation shaft with weapons ready. Sarah watched through her scope, providing overwatch while simultaneously monitoring the ongoing firefight at the main compound through her radio. Morrison's Marines were holding, but barely. The enemy had realized the initial assault had failed and was beginning to probe for weaknesses in the Marine defensive positions. If they found one, if they managed to flank Morrison's unit, the entire operation would collapse into a fighting retreat that might leave hostages and operators dead. Commander, you need to see this. Webb's voice carried excitement and vindication in equal measure. The shaft connects to a tunnel system. Looks intact Soviet construction throughout. It runs directly under the target structure. Sarah allowed herself 3 seconds of satisfaction. Her grandfather's documentation had been right. Decades-old intelligence preserved in family archives that the modern intelligence community had forgotten had just provided the tactical advantage that might save 4 lives. Outstanding. Webb, take the breach team and prepare charges for underground entry. I want us coming up through their floor before they realize we're there. Aye, ma'am, but Commander, the tunnel is tight. We'll have to move single file, and if there's any resistance inside, we'll be in a fatal funnel with no room to maneuver. I know, that's why I'm going first. You follow with charges ready. If we encounter obstacles, we breach through them. No stopping, no hesitation. We're committed now. Sarah moved to the ventilation shaft, her heart rate elevated but controlled. This was the moment. Everything came down to whether Soviet engineers had maintained consistent design patterns across 4,000 miles and 4 decades. The shaft dropped 6 feet to a concrete floor. Sarah lowered herself carefully, her rifle preceding her into darkness that her weapon light turned into harsh shadows and uncertain angles. The tunnel stretched in both directions, maybe 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. Tight quarters for combat, but perfect for concealment. She moved forward in a combat crouch, every sense heightened to maximum alertness. Behind her, Webb and the breach team followed in single file, their movement surprisingly quiet despite the confined space and heavy equipment. The tunnel ran for 40 meters before terminating at a heavy steel door. Soviet-era construction, definitely. Sarah examined the locking mechanism with her weapon light, recognizing the design from her grandfather's documentation. Mechanical rather than electronic. Simple, but effective. And vulnerable to someone who understood the engineering principles behind it. Sarah pulled out her multi-tool and went to work. The lock was corroded but functional. She worked each component methodically, feeling for the resistance points that would indicate proper alignment. Her hands were steady, despite the adrenaline flooding her system. 3 minutes later, the lock clicked open. Sarah eased the door inward, revealing a dark room that smelled of concrete dust and human fear. Her weapon light swept the space, identifying threat angles and potential dangers. Empty. A storage room abandoned except for rusted equipment and debris, but she could hear voices above her. Muffled conversation in Pashto, the words indistinct, but the tone clear. Guards. At least 2, possibly more. And somewhere in this structure, 4 Americans waited for rescue or execution. Webb moved up beside her, his face grim in the weapon light. That's the floor above us. If they're following typical Soviet design, there should be access stairs at the far end of this level. Sarah nodded and moved forward, her team flowing behind her, like water finding the path of least resistance. They cleared the storage level room by room, finding nothing but abandonment and decay. The stairs were where Webb predicted a concrete spiral leading upward into darkness. This was it. The moment where planning met reality and showed whether she'd truly earned command or had just been lucky so far. Sarah began climbing, each step measured and deliberate. The stairs were concrete, which meant noise discipline was critical. One careless footfall would alert the guards above and turn this rescue into a hostage execution. At the top of the stairs, another door. This one wasn't locked. Sarah could hear voices clearly now, close enough that she could distinguish individual speakers. 2 men talking in low tones about American politics and why the prisoners were valuable for propaganda purposes. She held up a fist, halting the team, then pointed to Webb and made a series of hand signals. Breach on my mark. Flashbang first. I'll take left, you take right. Webb nodded and moved into position. Sarah counted down from 3 on her fingers. 3, 2, 1. The door exploded inward. Webb's flashbang detonated with a disorienting blast that turned the room into temporary chaos. Sarah was through the door before the light had faded her rifle up and tracking for targets. 2 guards exactly as she'd predicted, both temporarily blinded and disoriented by the flashbang, both reaching for weapons they'd never get to raise. Sarah's first shot took the left guard center mass. Her second shot followed so quickly it sounded like one long pull. The guard dropped without firing a shot. Webb's target fell half a second later, similar placement, similar efficiency. The room cleared in under 3 seconds. Professional violence executed with the precision of years of training. And there in the corner of the room, 4 Americans huddled together in conditions that made Sarah's blood boil. 3 were young late 20s or early 30s aid workers who'd believed they could make a difference in a war zone that didn't want their help. They were dirty, malnourished, showing signs of rough treatment, but nothing immediately life-threatening. The 4th hostage was older. Gray hair, weathered face, eyes that had seen too much suffering. She sat apart from the others, her left leg clearly injured and infected based on the crude bandaging and fever flush across her face. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the woman James Brennan had died training replacements for. The woman who'd sent letters for 30 years telling his family about the lives she'd saved with skills he'd helped her learn. Recognition flashed in Warren's eyes as Sarah approached. Something about the face, the bearing the way Sarah moved, triggered memories from 3 decades ago. Chen, Warren's voice was hoarse from dehydration and infection. Sarah Chen, no wait. Brennan, Sarah Brennan, oh God, you're James's daughter. Recognition hit Warren like a physical blow. Tears cut tracks through the dirt on her face. He saved my life. Kuwait 91. I watched him die 2 years later knowing I was alive because of him. And now you're here, his daughter, saving mine. Sarah knelt beside Warren, her own eyes burning. Yes, ma'am. And I'm getting you out of here, all of you. That's what Brennans do. We bring people home. They nodded mutely, too shocked to speak. Good. Stay close and do exactly what we tell you. Sarah turned to Jennings. Get Overwatch on the line. Tell them we have the hostages and need immediate extraction from alternate LZ. Coordinates to follow. She started an IV line in Warren's arm, pushing antibiotics and fluids that the older woman desperately needed. Warren's infection was serious, possibly life-threatening if not treated aggressively. But she was conscious, she was mobile enough with support, and most importantly, she was alive. Your father, Warren whispered as Sarah worked. He saved my life in Kuwait. 91. Then he died training the next generation. I've thought about him every day for 30 years. Every life I saved, every person I helped, that was his legacy. I know, ma'am. You sent letters. My mother saved every one. And now I'm returning the favor. But we need to move. Can you walk with support? Warren nodded, gritting her teeth against obvious pain. I can do whatever it takes to get out of here. Sarah helped Warren to her feet, supporting the older woman's weight, while Webb organized the other hostages for movement. They were about to head for the stairs when the building shook with a massive explosion. The eastern wall collapsed, inward debris and dust filling the air. Through the gap, Sarah could see the pre-dawn sky and the flashes of ongoing combat. An RPG had struck the structure, whether by accident or design unclear, but the result was undeniable. Their planned escape route through the tunnel was now blocked by tons of rubble. They were trapped on the upper floor with hostages' limited ammunition and an enemy force that knew exactly where they were. Webb's voice cut through the chaos. Commander, tunnels collapsed. We can't get back the way we came. Sarah's mind raced through options, discarding impossibilities and focusing on what might work. The building was structurally compromised. Another RPG hit could bring the entire thing down on top of them. They needed a new exit route, and they needed it immediately. And then she saw it. A ventilation shaft in the ceiling partially exposed by the blast damage. Soviet engineers had built redundancy into everything, including emergency escape routes. Webb that shaft in the ceiling. Does it look large enough for personnel? Webb assessed quickly. Barely, ma'am. We'll have to go one at a time, and the hostages will struggle. But it's possible. Then that's our exit. Get charges on that grating and blow it open. We're going up and out. While Webb prepared the breaching charge, Sarah coordinated with Morrison. Reaper 1-6 Valkyrie 6. We have the hostages, but our egress route is compromised. We're going to emerge on the roof of the secondary structure. We need immediate suppression of enemy positions and extract helicopters at alternate LZ November 7. How copy? Morrison's response was strained. Solid copy Valkyrie 6. But be advised, enemy is pushing hard on our position. We're danger close on ammunition. Can give you maybe 10 mics of sustained suppression, then we'll need to displace or risk being overrun. 10 minutes. They had 10 minutes to get 4 hostages and 8 operators through a ventilation shaft across a damaged roof and to an evacuation point while under fire from an enemy that outnumbered them 3-1. Sarah touched her father's trident through her plate carrier. Then we make it work. Stand by for our emergency. Webb's charge detonated with a sharp crack, blowing the ventilation grating clean off. The shaft beyond looked barely wide enough for a person, let alone someone carrying equipment. Hostages first, Sarah ordered. Webb, you boost them up. Hutchison, you're receiving on the roof. Get them to the LZ as fast as possible. The young aid workers went first, fear overcoming hesitation, as Webb literally shoved them up into the shaft. They scrambled through with the desperate strength of people who knew death was the alternative. Warren went last among the hostages, her injured leg making the climb agonizing. Sarah supported from below while Webb pushed, basically forcing the older woman up into darkness. Warren's pained grunts echoed down the shaft, but she kept moving. Then the SEAL element began their climb. One by one, operators squeezed through the impossibly tight space, dragging equipment that threatened to catch on every projection and edge. Sarah went last, as commanders should. She was about to enter the shaft when gunfire erupted inside the room. The door they'd breached minutes earlier exploded inward as enemy fighters realized where the Americans had gone. Sarah spun her rifle up and firing in one smooth motion. 3-round bursts, center mass, professional violence that dropped 2 fighters before they could return fire effectively. But there were more behind them. So many more. She emptied her magazine, dropped it, and slammed home a fresh one in a reload that took less than 2 seconds. Fired again, taking down another fighter who'd tried to flank through the dust and debris. But they were coming faster than she could shoot them. In seconds, they'd be inside the room, and she'd be trapped at the base of the shaft with no cover and no room to maneuver. "Commander, move!" Webb's voice from above, urgent and commanding. Sarah fired one last burst and dove for the shaft. Her hands found purchase on the metal edges, and she pulled herself up with desperate strength. Bullets sparked off the metal around her, one round grazing her thigh with white-hot pain that she forced herself to ignore. She climbed through darkness that seemed to last forever, her shoulders scraping against metal, her gear catching on every protrusion. Below her, the gunfire continued as enemy fighters poured into the room she'd just evacuated. Sarah emerged onto the roof to find her team already moving toward the LZ, half-carrying Warren and the other hostages. The pre-dawn sky was lightening to gray, which meant they were losing the advantage of darkness. "Move, move, move," Sarah urged, forcing her injured leg to keep pace. The wound wasn't serious, a graze that hurt like hell, but hadn't hit anything critical. She'd survive if they could get to the extraction point before the enemy reorganized. The roof was damaged, unstable, with gaps that threatened to drop anyone who stepped wrong. Sarah navigated the obstacle course while returning fire at enemy positions that were starting to track their movement. Bullets chipped concrete and sparked off metal all around them. They reached the edge of the roof, and Sarah saw their next problem. 10 feet down to ground level, which might as well have been 100 for injured hostages and operators carrying heavy equipment. "Rope," Sarah shouted. "We need rope for the hostages." Hutchison was already on it, securing a line to a structural support that looked questionable but was their only option. The hostages descended one by one, their movements painful and slow but ultimately successful. Warren went last, her infected leg making the descent a nightmare of pain and determination. Sarah watched the older woman force herself down the rope, remembering the stories her grandfather had told about combat medics in the Pacific. The toughness required to survive in that world. Warren had that toughness. 30 years of humanitarian work in war zones hadn't softened her, had just refined the steel into something harder. Sarah was about to follow when a bullet struck her shoulder, the impact spinning her sideways. Her plate carrier took most of the energy, but the round had hit the edge where ceramic met soft armor. Pain exploded across her shoulder and upper chest. She felt blood running down inside her uniform. She looked up and saw the source. An enemy sniper positioned on higher ground with a clear line of sight to the LZ. As she watched, the sniper adjusted his aim toward the hostages who were now completely exposed on the ground below. Sarah made the calculation instantly. If that sniper got clean shots, Warren and the younger hostages would die before reaching cover. The only way to stop that outcome was to draw his attention elsewhere, to make herself the more attractive target. Webb. Sarah keyed her radio, her voice tight with pain. You're in command. Get those hostages to the extract point. That's an order. Commander, what? Sarah was already moving, sprinting across the damaged roof, away from the LZ, away from her team, toward the enemy position, making herself impossible to ignore. The sniper took the bait. His fire shifted from the hostages to Sarah, rounds impacting around her as she dove behind a concrete barrier that had once been part of the roof's defensive architecture. She returned fire, not aiming for kills, but for suppression, making the sniper keep his head down, keeping his attention focused on her instead of the Americans escaping below. Reaper 1-6, Valkyrie 6. Sarah's voice carried the strain of someone fighting alone against impossible odds. I've got a sniper pinning down the LZ. I'm drawing his fire, but I need immediate support. Morrison's response was instant. Reaper 1-6 copies. Blackwell is shifting position now. 30 seconds that felt like an hour. Sarah fired, displaced, fired again from a new position. The enemy sniper was good tracking her movement and putting rounds close enough that she felt the impacts through the concrete. Her shoulder burned with every movement, blood loss making her movement slightly sluggish. Then Corporal Emma Blackwell's M110 spoke once. A single shot from 800 meters away. The enemy sniper pitched backward and moved no more. Sarah slumped against her barrier, breathing hard. Good shot, Reaper. Outstanding shot. But she wasn't done yet. Through a gap in the debris, she could see her team reaching the LZ, could see the helicopters approaching their rotors, beating the air into submission, could see safety just 200 meters away. And between her and safety, an entire enemy force was realizing that most of the Americans had escaped and only one was left behind on the damaged roof. Sarah checked her ammunition. 2 magazines remaining, maybe 60 rounds total. Against 20-plus enemy fighters who would be coming for her any second now. She touched her father's trident one last time. Sorry, Dad. Did my best. Then Morrison's voice cut through her radio, angry and determined. Commander, you stay right where you are. I'm coming for you. Negative, Reaper. That's a direct order. Get those hostages on the birds and get clear. With all due respect, ma'am, fuck your direct order. I don't leave commanders behind. Blackwell, you're in command. Get the hostages extracted. I'm going back for her. Sarah tried to protest, but Morrison had already cut his radio. She saw him break from cover, sprinting toward her position while laying down fire that forced the enemy to seek cover rather than advancing. He was going to die trying to save her, was going to throw his life away on a hopeless rescue that served no tactical purpose except satisfying some code of honor that demanded he fix his earlier disrespect. But Sarah couldn't deny that watching Gunnery Sergeant Jake Morrison charge through enemy fire, defying her direct orders to save her life, felt like a kind of redemption she hadn't known she needed. Morrison reached her position and dove behind the barrier, breathing hard but grinning like a maniac. "Ma'am, you really need to work on your extraction timing." "I gave you a direct order, Sergeant." "Yes, ma'am, you did. I'll accept whatever punishment you think is appropriate. After we get out of here alive." Together they laid down covering fire while retreating toward the LZ. 2 operators against 20-plus enemies wounded and low on ammunition, fighting for every meter of ground. A bullet caught Morrison in the arm, spinning him sideways. Sarah grabbed his gear and pulled him behind cover, returning fire with her last magazine, while the gunnery sergeant applied a hasty pressure dressing to his wound. "We're not making it to the LZ on foot," Morrison said, his Texas drawl strained with pain. "We need another option." Sarah's vision was starting to narrow from blood loss, but her mind was still tactical. "The helicopters can't land under this fire. We need to create distance and reduce the threat profile." She pulled out her last 2 grenades. Fragmentation. Useful for area denial, but not decisive against an entrenched enemy, unless... Sarah studied the building they'd just evacuated. Structurally compromised by the RPG hit. Eastern wall already collapsed. Supporting columns visible and damaged. Another substantial explosion in the right location might bring the entire structure down. And between them and the building was a 20-meter gap filled with enemy fighters. "Sergeant, how's your throwing arm?" Morrison followed her gaze and understood immediately. "You want to collapse that building on the enemy. It'll buy us time to reach the LZ. Maybe enough time for the birds to land and extract us." "That's insane, ma'am." "You have a better idea." Morrison checked his own grenade supply. 1 frag, 1 smoke. We'd need to get within throwing range, through at least 10 hostiles, while wounded, in broad daylight. "So we make a run for it. Use the smoke for concealment. You throw first, I throw second. We collapse that building and run like hell for the extract point while the enemy is dealing with tons of falling concrete." Morrison laughed, a sound that carried equal parts respect and disbelief. "You're absolutely crazy, Commander. Your father must have been a hell of an operator." "He was. Now let's finish this so I can court-martial you properly for disobeying orders." They moved together, Morrison popping smoke while Sarah provided covering fire. The white phosphorus created a wall of concealment that lasted maybe 30 seconds. They used every one of those seconds sprinting through enemy positions while bullets searched for them in the smoke. Morrison threw his grenade first, the frag arcing perfectly through the damaged wall into the building's interior. Sarah's grenade followed 2 seconds later, aimed at a supporting column that looked ready to collapse. Both grenades detonated within a second of each other. The building groaned, a sound like the earth itself protesting. Then physics took over, and 3 stories of Soviet concrete decided that gravity was an excellent idea after all. The collapse created a massive dust cloud, and enough chaos to make the enemy fighters forget about 2 wounded Americans sprinting for the LZ. Sarah and Morrison ran with the desperate energy of people who knew this was their last chance. The helicopters had landed rotors, still turning crew chiefs, waving them forward with urgent gestures. Sarah saw her team, saw the hostages already aboard, saw safety just 50 meters away. They made it to 30 meters when Morrison stumbled, his wounded arm finally giving out. Sarah caught him before he could fall, supporting his weight while they covered the last distance together. Hands reached out from the helicopter, pulling them aboard. The aircraft lifted immediately, not waiting for anything approaching a normal departure sequence. just up and away, trading altitude for distance from the enemy below. Sarah collapsed onto the floor of the helicopter, her shoulder and leg screaming protest. A medic was already working on her, cutting away gear to access the wounds. Across from her, Morrison was receiving similar treatment, his face pale but determined. Dr. Warren, despite her own injuries and exhaustion, had crawled over to supervise the medical treatment. Pressure on that shoulder wound. She's losing blood faster than I'd like. Start an IV wide open. And someone check her for additional injuries. Sarah tried to speak, but Warren shushed her. You just saved my life, Commander. Saved all our lives. Now let me do what your father taught me to do. Save yours. The helicopter climbed higher, leaving the mountains and the enemy and the collapsed building behind. Through the open door, Sarah could see the dawn breaking across the Afghan landscape, painting the brutal terrain in shades of gold and red. She'd brought them home. All of them. 4 hostages and every operator who'd deployed on this mission. Her first command operation, and she'd accomplished the impossible through tactical adaptation, institutional knowledge that the intelligence community had forgotten, and a willingness to sacrifice herself for her people. Sarah looked at Morrison, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Respect, maybe. Understanding, definitely. The realization that everything he'd assumed about female commanders had been proven catastrophically wrong. That was a direct order violation, Sergeant, she managed to say, her voice weak but carrying command authority. Morrison smiled through his pain. Yes, ma'am, and I'd do it again. Couldn't leave my CO behind. We'll discuss your punishment later. Looking forward to it, Commander. Warren finished her initial assessment and sat back satisfied that Sarah would survive. You're just like your father, the older woman said quietly. Same tactical brilliance, same willingness to put yourself between your people and danger. He'd be so proud of what you've become. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the helicopter's vibration through her damaged body. Her father's trident pressed against her chest, warm from her blood and the exertion of combat. They'd made it. Against impossible odds, against enemy ambush, against structural collapse and sniper fire and her own wounds, they'd brought everyone home alive. The mission was a success, but more than that, she'd proven something to herself and to the men who doubted her. Command wasn't about rank or gender or politics. It was about competence under fire, tactical adaptation when plans failed, and the willingness to lead from the front when leadership demanded sacrifice. She'd earned her place, finally and completely. Not because anyone had given it to her, but because she'd taken it through blood and decision-making in the worst possible circumstances. Sarah let herself drift toward unconsciousness, trusting that her team would get her home, that Warren would keep her alive, that somehow, despite everything, this impossible day had ended with the only outcome that mattered. Everyone comes home. 3 days later, Sarah entered the Coronado mess hall on unsteady legs, her arm in a regulation sling, and a pronounced limp that would fade with physical therapy. The shoulder wound had required surgery to remove bone fragments and repair damaged tissue. The leg graze had been stitched and bandaged. Both hurt like hell, but neither was career-ending. She'd survived. They all had. Dr. Warren was in the base hospital receiving treatment for her infection, expected to make a full recovery. The 3 younger hostages had been debriefed and released to their families. Morrison was walking around with his arm bandaged, but refusing light duty, claiming he'd been shot worse during training accidents. The mess hall went silent when Sarah entered. Not the hostile silence of her first day, but something different. Something that felt like acknowledgement. Then, as she watched, every SEAL and Marine in the room stood, not at attention, not formally, but rising from their seats in a gesture of respect that needed no words. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She nodded once, acknowledging the gesture, then moved to collect her food. The conversations resumed, but at a lower volume. People watched her move through the room, but not with skepticism, with the kind of attention that came from having witnessed competence under fire. She found an empty table and was about to sit when Morrison approached, moving with careful precision around his wounded arm. "Commander Brennan, permission to join you, ma'am." Sarah gestured to the seat across from her. "Granted, Sergeant." Morrison sat, his usual confidence tempered by something that looked like humility. He arranged his food carefully before speaking. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. Not just for pulling your hair in this mess hall 3 days ago, for every assumption I made before I knew who you were, before I saw what you could do. You made up for it when it mattered, Sergeant." "No, ma'am, that doesn't erase what I did, what I said." Morrison met her eyes directly. "My father taught me a lot of things right about being a Marine, but he taught me some things wrong about women in combat roles, about female leadership, about whether someone like you belonged in command." He pulled out his wallet and extracted $500 bills, placing them on the table between them. "This was my bet. Against you, lasting through the first firefight. I was so convinced I was right that I put real money on it." Morrison pushed the bills toward Sarah. "I want to donate this to a Women Veterans Scholarship Fund, if you'll help me do that. If you'll let me try to fix some of the damage men like me have done." Sarah looked at the money, then at Morrison. The gunnery sergeant who dismissed her so casually was gone. In his place was someone who'd seen the truth and was trying to become better because of it. "I'll match it," she said quietly. "500 from me, 500 from you. $1,000 toward helping the next generation of female operators get the training and opportunities they deserve." Morrison nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Thank you, ma'am, and thank you for not leaving me behind when you had every right to, when I'd earned being left behind through my own stupidity." "I don't leave people behind, Sergeant. That's not how I was trained. That's not the legacy my father left me. Your father would be damn proud of what you did out there, of who you've become." They ate in companionable silence for several minutes before Morrison spoke again. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am." "Always, Sergeant." "I requested a transfer. Want to serve under your permanent command if SEAL Team 7 will have a Marine attachment. Figure I've got a lot to learn about real leadership, and you're the best teacher I'm likely to find." Sarah studied Morrison, seeing the sincerity behind the request. The man who'd pulled her hair and told her to fuck off was genuinely asking to serve under her command, to learn from someone he dismissed as incompetent based on nothing but gender. "I'll consider it, Sergeant, pending review of your conduct during the mission and completion of your medical recovery. If you're serious about this, I'll need you to understand that serving under my command means accepting that competence has no gender, that the best operator wins regardless of what's between their legs." "I understand, ma'am, and I accept those terms completely." Sarah extended her hand. Morrison shook it, his grip firm but careful of her injuries. As Morrison returned to his table, Sarah noticed Corporal Blackwell watching from across the room. The young Marine sniper gave Sarah a subtle nod, a gesture of solidarity from one female operator to another. Sarah returned the nod, understanding what it meant. They were still rare, still fighting for every ounce of respect in a world that wanted them to fail. But they were winning, one mission at a time, one converted skeptic at a time. One perfect shot that proved capability trumped prejudice. Sarah finished her meal and disposed of her tray. As she walked toward the exit, she touched the pocket where her father's trident rested. The metal was warm as always, A reminder of legacy and sacrifice and the particular burden of following in footsteps that led to early graves. But also a reminder that some things were worth the cost, that proving yourself in the hardest possible circumstances was its own reward, that bringing people home alive against impossible odds was the purest form of command. Later that evening, Sarah sat alone in her office, reviewing the after-action reports from the mission, recommendations for decorations, incident analyses, intelligence assessments of what had gone wrong with the original planning, and how to prevent similar failures in the future. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. Commander Brennan. Sarah, it's Elizabeth Warren. They're letting me make phone calls from the hospital. Sarah sat up straighter, ignoring the protest from her shoulder. Dr. Warren, how are you feeling? Better. The antibiotics are working. The infection is responding to treatment. They tell me I'll be stateside in another week for continued recovery. Warren paused. I wanted to call you personally, to thank you, and to tell you something about your father. Ma'am, after your father saved my life in Kuwait after he died training my replacements, I made a promise. Every life I saved, every person I helped over the next 30 years, that would be his legacy, that his sacrifice wouldn't be for nothing. Warren's voice caught slightly. I kept that promise. Thousands of people alive today because of the skills your father helped me learn. I know, ma'am. Your letters meant everything to my mother, to me. But now you've saved my life, saved all of us, which means the legacy continues. The people I help from this day forward, that's your legacy now. Your father's sacrifice passed through me, passed through you. 3 generations of Brennans, all dedicated to bringing people home alive. Sarah felt tears threatening but forced them back. That's the job, ma'am. That's what we do. It's more than a job, Sarah. It's a calling. And you answered it the same way your father did, with competence and courage and a willingness to sacrifice yourself for others. The trident you wear, you've earned it in ways most operators never will. Remember that when the doubters come, because they'll keep coming, but you've proven yourself beyond any doubt. After the call ended, Sarah sat in the darkness of her office, her father's trident warm in her hand. On her wall, she'd hung 3 photographs. Her grandfather Theodore in his World War II uniform, her father James from his SEAL days, and now a photograph from the mission her Team 7 operators and Morrison's Marines together after the successful extraction. 3 generations, 3 wars, 1 legacy of service and sacrifice and bringing people home alive. Sarah placed her father's trident on the desk beside her own. 2 pieces of metal that represented everything she'd fought to achieve. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more skeptics, more missions where she'd have to prove herself all over again. But tonight in this moment, she'd earned something that couldn't be taken away. Not respect given, not authority granted, but competence proven through blood and decision-making in the worst possible circumstances. She'd brought them home, all of them, and in doing so had proven that Commander Sarah Brennan hadn't just inherited her father's legacy, she'd surpassed it. The tridents caught the light from her desk lamp. 2 pieces of metal representing 3 generations who'd answered when their nation called. Some legacies were written in policy manuals. Others were written in the lives saved the operators brought home the impossible missions accomplished. Sarah Brennan's legacy would be both. Earned through competence no one could deny. Proven in mountains where lesser commanders would have failed. Respect wasn't demanded. It was earned, and she'd earned it. Finally. Completely. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tonight she'd allow herself the satisfaction of knowing everyone had come home. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.